Hello everyone. Today I will be painting from this image of nimbus clouds and the sunset sky, which already as a description sounds like a pretty cool painting idea. However, I will be really analyzing this image in terms of shapes and colors and design. So in order to make the painting better than the image in front of me, I will be really thinking about how can I direct the viewer's gaze into the focal point, which, for me, is the light filtering through the clouds. And as a secondary interest, the way the shapes of the clouds zigzag the eye to the center of interest. I am beginning with a burnt sienna warm and transparent neutral lay-in, and I place the horizon line below the center line so that the clouds can dominate. The horizon line has become more of a diagonal for a sense of drama that will add to the mood of the painting, which is supposed to be a dramatic painting. I also went ahead and filled in the terrain because it is silhouetted against the sunlight in the sunset, which is a unique feature of sunset lighting. At this stage, I have mapped out most of my main shapes, and I have not only separated the positive shape of the cloud from the negative shape of the sky with my lines, but I've also separated the shadow side of the cloud from the light side of the cloud with masses. I did this because even though the cloud as a whole is a dark shape, as in if I were to simplify the design of the photo into two tones, the cloud would be in the dark side and the sky would be in the light side, I also want to get a sense of the form of the clouds and how one overarching plane moves away from the light source and another overarching plane moves toward the light source. I am still staying very organized in grouping values into one big shadow shape or one big light shape and not breaking them down into smaller value shapes. Later on, I will be layering color on top of this, and I want to make sure that the values of the colors are always darker in the shadow side than they are in the light side. That way, the clouds can read as a rolling form. Maintaining value control is definitely much easier said than done because even though you are simplifying, it does not make it easy. It means you have to commit to the design of the shapes and where the shadow is and where the light is, and not get lost in the details. It gets especially tricky as you are adding color to the painting because it's not just a color factor that's added, but also the elements that are included with color, which include hue, saturation, value, and temperature. Because there are so many factors to consider with color and also paint application and color mixing, it is very important to stay organized at this stage of the painting because even though it is very forgiving and will be covered, later on it will help immensely with keeping organized and limiting the number of factors you have to think about at the same time. When you are plein air painting outside and not working in the studio, it's harder to spend all this time being very organized like this. So you usually start your underpainting with a few quick brush strokes and indications before jumping into color. When you do paint from life, you can use tools such as the value finder or even just squinting your eyes to find the large shapes and the values. But since we do have the luxury of all this time in the studio to make a careful map of the shapes in the underpainting, when you add the opaque color, you can almost treat it like a paint by number with the shapes you have already established. Here is the final image of the underpainting for before I add opaque paint with color added. When I add the color to the clouds, I will aim to maintain the difference between the shadow side and the light side while making the overall cloud shape a darker mid-tone so that the sky can really shine through. Here's my palette with all the tones put into neat piles. On the right is where I mixed for the clouds. And to do that, I started out with a 50-50 mix of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. Then I added yellow ochre to desaturate it a little bit and also lighten it because the shadow side is pretty much always going to be more desaturated than the light side, with the exception of reflected light. Yellow ochre is a nice soft neutral with a yellow tendency to add to the purple, as opposed to a very bright warm yellow like cadmium yellow, which will make the mixture very brown very fast. Next to each of the three levels of yellow ochre and purple mixture on the y-axis of the palette, I added different levels of white tint using different ratios of titanium white. While only one of these purple and yellow ochre tinted piles will be the main tone for the shadow side of the clouds, the other piles of purple and yellow ochre mixture can be great convenience tones for when I mix new colors as I go along. Next, I added Viridian to the most light and most neutral purple. The resulting blue-gray mixture will be the light side of the clouds, since it will show the influence of the blue in the sky. Next, I tinted separate piles of warm yellow and warm red, And I mix those two together to make a warm orange with no addition of complements or anything. I want these to be high chroma pastel colors so that the sunlight that I'm going to paint with them can really shine. Next, I mixed the neutral part of the sky as it moves away from the sunlight by intermixing piles that I already made on the palette. I'm keeping it all in the family, and so to speak, instead of introducing new pigments to the palette, which can easily complicate the color harmony more. With this in mind, I actually did introduce a new color to the palette by mixing phthalo blue with the neutral mixtures. I did this because I felt like the palette was missing a blue tone, and I wanted to include the range of the color wheel in the painting since it will be a very strongly color-oriented painting. This is optional, and whether you make the painting more about colors or values is really up to you and your preferences. Finally, I intermix colors to make another neutral tone, and this will serve as a transition tone where the edges are soft between the sky and the cloud. To summarize, on the left is the overall color of the sunlight, the middle is the neutral and blue-green tones of the sky, and the right is the light and shadow of the clouds, as well as convenience tones for mixing more nuanced tones in the clouds later. So I have my underpainting all mapped out, and I also have all my colors mixed, so pretty much at this stage I can treat this painting like a paint by number. I'm just filling in the shadow side with the shadow color, which is the tinted and yellow ochre neutralized purple. Now, already I can tell that probably the shadows are too dark and too purple, but I'm not too concerned yet. First of all, I need to see the colors on the canvas to see the relationships first before I make that decision, and then I can adjust accordingly. And I am also able to change the darks to light pretty easily with oil paint, as opposed to the other way around. With oil paint, if you start too light, then the paints can get too muddy and chalky when working with the wet into wet technique. So for now, I am okay with an approximate mixture of what I see, as opposed to a perfect mixture. Now I am doing a paint by number for the light side of the cloud. So this stage is pretty easy for now because I did all the prep work for it beforehand. As a general rule for oil painting, it is best to start by laying in the dark shapes first so you can see the overall structure of the canvas. Even before laying in the darker shadow planes, you can also as a first step lay in the accents, which would be the darkest darks, the lightest lights, and also the most saturated areas. So first step if you wish, accents. Second step, lay in the darker planes before laying in the lighter planes. And the final step is to lay in all the overall tones of the canvas so you can see all the color relationships clearly before rendering. Now, this is going to be a bad example of the third step because I actually do skip to the rendering for demonstration purposes, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. So now to the premature rendering stage. I am adding transition tone along the edge of the shadow plane and the light plane. I do this so I can blend selectively and also so that I do not make a muddy mess of the paint. It will pretty much create more of the effect of what you see in a Bouguereau painting where there are nice turning forms on his figures. If you just blend the darks and the lights together with wet onto wet technique, you'll get the effect of what you see on Photoshop when you use the blur or smudge tool instead. Working in gouache is a great way to force yourself to think of transition tones as mixed tones in themselves instead of two blended planes together. This is what we call tiling technique. Now to lay in the sky, which for me is a fun part. It really is just a big block of color as the backdrop for the nimbus cloud. So I'm making each gradient level its own color because each level between the warmth of sunlight and the neutrals has its own beautiful character. And now for the part that I've been waiting for, the sunlight filtering through the clouds and the sunlight itself. Well, unfortunately, it did not work out quite the way I wanted it to at first. At this stage, it looks like lines, and they're all looking equally spread apart, which is a big no-no in compositional design in general. So that's okay, I will work on the edges, colors, and shapes later. It is a pretty elusive area, so it's going to take some experimenting, which should be more fun than frustrating. It is all part of the learning process, even if it is frustrating. So I have most of my colors down, so I'm just refining my values, refining my edges, and adding more gradients of transition tones so that the form can really roll. And now for another fun part, I actually do blend. So I'm using a mop scroll brush, which I believe might be a watercolor brush, but I find it is a great mop for getting those large areas blended. I am also using a soft, small, round sable brush to flick edges together where the edges are a little more defined. This is called a firm edge. So this is what this stage of the painting looks like. It is my first pass of opaque paint. I like it pretty well, but something is a bit missing for me. First of all, the clouds are a little bit too defined because of the darkness and purple of the shadow that I predicted. And my original intention to make the sunlight and rays of light a focal point is kind of lost here. I see the clouds more as a focal point, and that's great too, but I really want the rays of the light to stand out more. I am going to make what looks to be an ambitious move here. I am scubbling a mixture of phthalo blue and titanium white, sometimes cadmium yellow as well, and I'm adding that over the dry painting. Scumbling will help me make the range of the values in the clouds close together. It will also add an overall blue-green tone to most of the canvas. I want this because it will give a sense of harmony to the atmosphere of the painting, as well as provide a blue-green and red-orange complementary color contrast with the sunlight that will be the focal point. Scumbling is great too because it will only create a film under which the original edges and shadow and light shades will still show through, so my original painting will not be completely lost, it will just be modified by a semi-transparent layer. I can spread this layer around with a soft brush, I can remove it with a rag. It's really a pretty forgiving step. So I'm combining indirect or glazing and scumbling technique with the direct opaque painting technique that I originally started with. So this is a bit more of an experimental approach. I also found that the silhouette of the terrain is not really working for me because it is just one big black shape like a backdrop of a stage. That is what I see in my photo because the photo is exposed for the light. This is so that the sky could show all the detail, but then, as a trade-off, the shadows and darks got lost. So here I have to invent a little bit and be creative. What really helps me in these situations is to look at solutions of other artists when they paint similar light situations. I found a Monet painting, and that really helped me figure out how I can handle this large, daunting, flat silhouette. I combined the information I got from the Monet painting with this high exposure version of the terrain. I made this from an edit in Photoshop. I combined the broken color technique and blue and cool red tones from the Monet painting with the information I got from the high exposure version of the terrain in the photo, which will show the crevices of the shadows in the hills and the texture of the bushes. Now that I've established all the major areas on the painting, now it is time to get to what my professor used to call the dessert of the painting, which is the bright focal point here, the sunlight. Of course, painting light is a big task, and that is what the Impressionists made a whole study and exploration in their entire movement. So thanks to the Impressionist painters, we have discovered a lot of different techniques you can use to make the sunlight really seem like it glows, even though you are just using pigment. The easiest way to do this is with contrast. You can use contrast of saturation, contrast of temperature, or contrast of value. The effects of contrast make your painting stand out by default anyway, so this is a win-win situation. Another related technique I'm going to try out is adding a ring of bright reddish tone around the illumination. I am only going to add a spot of highlight for the sunset and make the colors around it very warm and high chroma. I guess you could say I'm creating a ring of fire with color. And for this technique, I am once again referencing Monet because he is the master of painting light and making light his subject matter as opposed to any tangible object. Now finding the placement of this red ring is a bit challenging because the clouds are blocking off the sun a little bit, or quite a bit actually, so I have to navigate around those as I implement this technique. Even though I'm making a demo video for this painting, I'm actually more experimenting as I go along rather than knowing what I'm doing. But this just shows the joy of painting. You are always learning, and that is what I love about it. In the process of painting this landscape, I definitely used my photo for a lot of the inspiration, but I did not copy it entirely because it does not tell the whole story. Instead, I used my design sense, my experience from painting outdoors, as well as references from other artists in the past and how they handled similar situations. In this case, I looked at Monet. Thank you so much for watching this video about my process for the landscape painting from a photo reference. I hope you have a great day and maybe feel inspired to paint your own landscape painting.